It's okay. I've never been on a spotlight, so this is new. But my name is Hopton. Great to be in the space with you all. I won't introduce our center so much since Annie did a great job of talking about our center, but just to remind everyone, as has been talked about before, we're here to discuss the importance of centering educators in our work and the importance of educator voice and perspective. So we study the workforce, but that doesn't mean we know everything. We recognize that there are many ways to understand the ECE system and how to make it better for educators and families involved. Early educators are the best spokespeople about the conditions under which they work and what they need in order to thrive. Policy leaders have much to gain by actively engaging educators in identifying the workable solutions to the childcare crisis. And we cannot be spokespeople for educators, but need to meaningfully engage them in our work and uplift their perspectives, which is something that we're always striving to do better and more thoroughly. Our hope is that we can all deepen this work together from our various roles within the system, and a reminder that we see positive impact and big wins when early educator voice is included and is centered from the start. Next slide, please. So here's a quote from Corinne Hendrickson, who's a family child care provider from Wisconsin and the founder of We Can from Wisconsin. ECE and childcare professionals must see themselves and be seen as professionals who are knowledgeable, trusted sources. We need to work with the regulatory and nonprofit agencies that purport to support us to ensure that their policies and funding are truly needed by the ECE field. It is only when all players in the field act with integrity that we can move forward together to create a system that truly meets the needs of professionals, families, and our communities. So again, that's from Corinne Hendrickson, who founder of We Can, family childcare provider and contributor of to the CSCC learning community. We think that this is just a great quote to center us within this conversation. And with that, I'll pass it back, or I'll pass it to Annie.
Thanks, Hopton. Yeah, I love that quote from Kareen. And we'll talk a little bit more about the learning community in a second. But as Hopton said, early educators, as key experts and individuals who are impacted materially by policy changes, should be consulted on all kinds of workforce related policies. I particularly work on the Bold on Compensation learning community that Hopton mentioned. And so here are some examples of more compensation related policies that educators should definitely be consulted on. And these are things like, how do you distribute compensation enhancements equitably? What's a fair process that lowers administrative burden and makes it easier for programs to access funds? How do you incorporate educator voice in your cost estimation models, especially around compensation if you have aspirations to improve that? How do you incorporate educator voice around developing salary scales that account for education and experience or competency in an equitable way? And how to ensure access to benefits or public assistance programs as you work to advance compensation. And these are just some of the many policy decisions that have trade-offs that will materially impact educators' lives, and they are key experts from within the system, and so should be able to speak to and contribute to those decisions. Next slide, please. But what does this look like in practice? Here are some examples from our Bold on Compensation learning community. That's a group of 7 states where we bring together educators and legislators and advocates and state administrators to really talk about what it means to advance compensation. And so we asked that group for examples of educator engagement. Hopton already mentioned Kareen and the educator-led group that she co-founded called We Can, and they are really powerful advocates in the state of Wisconsin. Not only are they forging relationships with the legislature and media, but they're also doing a lot of really important organizing and education among their peers with other educators to really bring people along and make sure they're comfortable going, to hearings and things like that. There's also a role that state agencies or other intermediaries can play in creating the space to engage educators. So also in Wisconsin, there's the Shared Service Alliance that regularly engages its membership in advocacy and creates pathways to the agency for communication. Also in New Mexico, the early childhood department themselves actually had regular open calls during COVID to hear from folks in the field. Similarly, Strategies for Children is an advocacy group in Massachusetts, and they still to this day have regular open calls for practitioners and educators in the field to call in and share their experiences. And then they have more intentional and targeted ways to incorporate educator leadership in some of their coalition work. And in another more intentional and targeted manner, we've heard about the design group that Childcare Aware of Washington has put together. They're working on a range of systems level recommendations, particularly around compensation. But this is a group of 30 plus early educators from diverse backgrounds who are being engaged using a trauma-informed and liberatory design method, which is really promising. Next slide, please. And as Hopeton also mentioned, when educators are part of the design and leaders in the advocacy, there are huge wins. So many of you already probably have heard about the wins in New Mexico, where voters permanently enshrined annual state funding for early childhood. And educator leaders working with an advocacy group called OLE were instrumental in this huge win. And in DC, a really powerful broad coalition built by DC Action was part of it. Many of the wins of the last couple of years around winning advanced compensation and access to healthcare premiums for early educators. And these huge wins took decades of organizing and really a commitment to educator voices and leadership. Next slide, please. So it's, perhaps if you're not in an advocacy organization or role, it's also really important for policymakers to be thinking about how to develop short and long-term plans for including educators in policy spaces, not just on a sort of like one-off or individual basis, but really creating the conditions for things like stronger professional associations, boards, unions and collective bargaining, and really supporting policy advocacy through creating space for testimonial and communication with legislators. And of course, more on the advocacy side, there's things like rallies. There was the successful Day Without Care organized by Community Change and other organizers in the spring. And we also want to note that this can include creating conditions for new kinds of policy and change making. So it's not just about getting educators to go to very traditional policy spaces that are very white or male or, organized in a certain way where you have to know all the jargon, but it's about establishing policy change work in spaces where the power dynamics are shifted. So a really powerful example of this has been educators and program directors inviting state legislators to come visit their programs. So they did this in New Mexico, and then they had a state legislator come to a program, and then at the end of the day, they presented the legislator with a fake check to demonstrate the amount that they would have earned for their time there, obviously to demonstrate how low pay the time there would have been. Next slide, please. And in the long term, we're really thinking ahead towards collective bargaining and unionization as a strategy that has potential for improving working conditions of ECE workforce. Because of the way the sector is so fragmented and the workplaces are often so isolated, this does require a lot of creativity and strategy. Also because of historic racism and sexism that excluded domestic workers from labor protections, there are added legislative hoops in some states to ensure that home-based providers can unionize. But an example of a successful unionization here in California, where Hopeton and I both are, CCPU, the Child Care Providers Union, now represents home-based providers in California. It took about 20 years of organizing, and they recently won some, higher rates and things like that from the state. We do have a paper on unionization for the ECE workforce that I think we can drop in the chat, but that also talks about some of the possibilities for states and advocates interested in entering into bargaining relationships and some guidance for worker advocacy groups. And another long-term strategy is data collection and research. I think if done well and stewarded thoughtfully, data collection can be about representing educators at large through understanding their context, demographics, working conditions, and then by thoughtfully using qualitative data to contextualize their own words and perspectives. I think going even further, and this is something we're exploring at our center too, but community-based participatory research models offer methods for really designing and co-creating research alongside educators as collaborators. So with that, I'll pass it back to Hopeton to talk a little bit more about some other strategies and recommendations.
Thanks, Annie. So some strategies for centering for centering educators. Authentically engaging and centering educators starts with understanding inequities that exist in ECE and identifying who is being most impacted by these inequities. So it's important to uplift the perspectives of educators who face systemic barriers to resources and recognition, which include but are not limited to educators of color, educators who speak languages other than English, or those who work in settings or roles that are often overlooked, like home-based educators, or those who work in centers as assistants. So some logistical things to consider. One, attention to when meetings are held. So making sure that meetings are held at a time in which educators can participate and join. So finding times in evenings or on weekends. Also making sure that the meetings are offered in languages other than English and having translation available. Enabling closed captioning. And Annie referenced jargon earlier, but making sure that during the meetings, the language is accessible. So cutting down on research type jargon, policy type jargon, and taking time to acquaint everyone with the virtual tools and platform. So recognizing that not everyone uses Zoom or Teams or whatever other platform daily. So that also kind of goes hand in hand with the accessible language. It's just finding a way to create a space that's more accessible and inclusive. And then also at the end, sending out a recording afterward for those who cannot come. Thoughtful facilitation has to come with attention to airtime and power dynamics. So facilitators should seek to learn with and from educators rather than to lecture educators. And this work must consider power differentials and structural conditions. So those with the most power should carry more of the weight. And in practice, again, this means recognizing that educators are the experts in their field and that researchers, advocates, anyone else who is not an educator should learn from educators and use their platform and data to support educator-led advocacy efforts. Next slide, please. Other strategies. Compensating educators for engagement. So I think all of us in the room understand that compensation is a huge issue in ECE, and it would be very ironic and very terrible to perpetuate that. So making sure that we compensate educators for engagement, that includes not only for their time, but for transportation and substitute teachers. Funding compensation for educator engagement. This is something that Annie put me onto. In Massachusetts, the Department of Early Education or Early Care and Education plan to use their PDG funds to compensate educator engagement as a part of their needs assessment. So advocating for use of funds in this way to make sure that educator engagement is something that is more central to this work. Next slide, please. Here are some educator-specific resources that we have from CSCCE. So we have the E4 toolkit, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We have the ECHOS project, which is our big history project that details ECE in the US, movements within the US. Yeah, it's a great resource to check out. And off-mute and amplified intergenerational conversation. I think these are all being added into the chat. The third one is a conversation that kind of builds off of the ECHOS page that includes people who are from the worthy wage movement and current early educators. Next slide, please. So the E4 toolkit, and I'll go through this pretty quickly. It's a tool that CSCCE co-created with early educators to support educators in their advocacy, power building, and engagement with stakeholders. It facilitates connecting educators to broader data about themselves and their peers for the purposes of educator-led advocacy. So the main thing we did was we took our many pieces of work at CSCCE and moved it into a concise and easily digestible toolkit that can be used in a number of different spaces. So And group settings of early educators is a way to build shared understanding and alliances, and conversations with advocacy organizations, and in policymaking spaces. So yeah, it's an example of a way in which we engaged and centered educators in the process and created something together. Next slide. And if you know how to use a QR code, take out your phone, scan the scan the QR code at the top, and here's some additional resources. In addition to the three that I mentioned earlier, the advocacy journey, which is the blog from Kareen, the National Equity Project, human-centered design, and Annie discussed this earlier, the paper on unionization and organizing in the field. So yeah, that's all we have. Thanks for bringing us into the space and allowing us to be in the space. And with that, I'll pass it on.
Thank you so much to both of you. I do want to mention that all of the resources mentioned in the presentation shared on this slide are being placed in the chat, but they'll also be on the exchange in a resource section. So make sure to check that out. Well, now that we've heard the importance of the inclusion of educator voice in the design and revision of policy and practice, and started to hear some ways that other locations are doing that and others are finding ways of success around that, we're really excited to introduce our collaborating partner from Start Early, Sheetal Singh, to share with us the framework, a framework for centering educator voice through human-centered design.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Hi, I'm Sheetal Singh. I'm with Start Early. And very quickly, for those of you who might not be familiar with my organization, we are a nationally focused research, policy, practice, and systems building organization. And I run a team called the Early Learning Lab, which is the in-house innovation lab for Start Early. And so as in that role, I'm really pleased to be able to partner with lots of different departments and lots of external partners all across the country on thinking about tools and technologies and strategies from the social innovation space and how they might be applied to early childhood. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about human-centered design and how we can use that to center the voice of the workforce in both policy and programming. I'm going to share a couple of examples from our work to kind of talk about how this can be drilled down and hit home. Next slide, please. So the first thing that might come to your mind is this question of what is human-centered design? And I'm going to assume that some of you are very familiar with it and may have actually been using it or have used it. And some people might not know what it is. The dictionary definition or the Wikipedia entry is that human-centered design is a practice that actually came out of Stanford University in the 1960s, and it was used in engineering product design. And it at the center is the radical idea that the people who use products, their experience should be core to the way that those products are designed. And some tools and products that you probably use in your everyday life came out of a human-centered design process that includes the computer mouse. Actually, I don't know if people use mice very much anymore, but once upon a time, people used mice a lot with their computers, and other consumer products like the Swiffer, which was an innovation on the mop. So it is a fun and useful process that has now expanded over the past couple of decades to the social sector. And particularly in our field, it's a great strategy for helping to really center diverse voices in the way that programs and services are being developed. And it's really about incorporating lots of different perspectives. So before I talk about what the steps in the process, I really wanted to center that mindsets are very important to this process. One of the things that I get asked very often when I talk about user research or design research, because human-centered design is a type of design research, And our field can be very academic. And so for a researcher, it might seem like a kind of strange and a different process and a different way of thinking. And it really is. I like to think of traditional research as a process that really helps us understand the way that things are. But design research is a process that helps us imagine the way that things can be. And so as we think about developing new policies and new programming and new practices, it can be a really great tool for equity. And so these mindsets are really key to being able to successfully use human-centered design. I would say the key thing is the idea that everyone is an expert. We need to really kind of expand our definition of expertise. It doesn't matter if you have a PhD or a GED, right? You are an expert on your experience. And human-centered design is a process in which we try to get as many perspectives as possible to see things from as many different sides as possible. So you'll see a set of mindsets here that are essential. You have to be curious. You can't walk into this process thinking that you already know everything or you have all of the answers. This is about reaching out for help, really trying to gather as many different perspectives as possible and really listening to people, asking for help, which can be a radical act. There's a real bias to action in that this is not about studying a problem and then maybe putting a paper together. This is really about putting some new ideas out into the world. And so we go through this design process, come up with ideas, put them out as prototypes so that we can test small ideas, look at our data. It's a true continuous quality improvement process in that we're always putting things out, seeing what impact they're having, measuring that, and then improving on it. It is a messy process. So again, if you want to be quick and efficient, don't use human-centered design, because the fastest way to do something is to just go back into your conference room with your team and design something from the top down. That's not how this works. We often talk about we're not going from point A to point B in a straight line. It's a very squiggly line. But I do really want to emphasize that, yes, the squiggly line gets straightened out and we end up in hopefully a better place than we were at the beginning. But just as important as the outcome to a human-centered design process is that squiggly line, that messy journey that you go on with other people to really understand and share different perspectives and share different understanding and come together, is also an outcome of the process. And centering different voices and making sure that different people feel heard is one of the outcomes of the process that we are shooting for. And that's just as important as the new policy or program that we come up with at the end. And oftentimes we have to constantly, as we're doing this, reframe our problem, because sometimes the problem that we think we need to solve actually ends up not being the problem that really does need to be solved. And so that's one of the discoveries that happens through the process. Next slide, please. So this slide makes this seem very simple, but as I said, it is a messy process, but there are some phases or steps that we go through. So the first step is discovery. We come up with what we think is a problem, and then we go out in the world and talk to as many people as we can. And this could be through interviews or focus groups or observations, ethnographic study, right? We're going out, we're often in this phase doing some blue sky thinking about the problem and really letting the big ideas come from people unfiltered. And then we move into a process called interpretation, where we take all of the data that we've gathered and try to make sense of it, usually categorizing into different buckets, for lack of a better term, about what we're hearing from people. The next phase, ideation, is a collaborative, creative brainstorming process that we do with users, where we take all of the data that we've gathered and synthesized and start to do our what ifs. What if we tried this? what if we put this out into the world? And then, as you can see, we move into experimentation, which is a phase where you're trying out a couple of different things. Again, small prototypes, so not fully fledged programs, but small things to test our assumptions as we're learning along the way, checking the impact that we're having, and then we move into possibly one or two things that are looking really promising, developing them more fully, resourcing them. And then, as I said, this is at its heart a continuous quality improvement process. So we're always evolving, we're always learning, we're always seeing how things are being used, what the impact is, and improving. So there's a little bit of a rinse and repeat in this cycle. Next slide, please. So at Start Early, we offer we use human-centered design in a couple of different ways. In one way, we work with state and local leaders as consultants. The state and local leaders will come to us with a particular problem that they're trying to solve. Often they want to make sure, as they're thinking through solutions, they're really centering the voice of community members and the workforce and families. And so they come to us and they will ask us to use a human-centered design process to help them think through a problem. And another set of work that we do is really around capacity building, which is where we work with those state and local leaders, but instead of working directly on a problem or an issue, we are training them in how they can use human-centered design with their workforce or with their families, and do this in an ongoing way. So I'm going to share a couple of very quick examples because we don't have too much time. And the first one is some consulting work that we did on a policy level. Next slide, please. So for this project, we were working with a state level advocacy organization that was working on an issue that's probably familiar to everyone on this webinar, workforce retention, right? So as I said, if you could think back to that process, the discovery phase is something that our client actually started, and then we came in and also assisted them with, which is the going really wide. So we conducted interviews and focus groups with a wide variety of people from all over the state. This is teachers and systems leaders, and again, really did that blue sky thinking in terms of, if you could wave your magic wand, what would you do? What do you think teachers need to enter this profession and stay and be happy and thrive in their work? So this was really a time for blue sky thinking. We then went back and worked with our client to really make sense of what we were hearing, as I said, and bucketed things into a couple of different promising areas to dig into. Next slide, please. So the fun part, not that wasn't fun, but the more fun part is the ideation phase, which involved us going to the state and facilitating a day-long event with 40 leaders and teachers all coming together and digging into these promising areas. And this was a highly facilitated event to foster creative and collaborative brainstorming. And through this process of thinking about how might we do X, Y, or Z, they came up with a lot of ideas. We're in the process now of working with our client to kind of prioritize and put things into a now, next, and later buckets, because some of the ideas were just low-hanging fruit that this advocacy organization can take and run with, and some were kind of more long-term policy ideas. But that it was very fruitful and everyone was pleased. And next slide, please. You'll remember when we were talking about the mindsets, I said that the process that you go through and the time it takes to make sure that people feel heard is just as important as the outcome, right? And I was very pleased to see the post-event feedback. This is the survey that we sent after. You'll see that we had 100% of people saying that it was excellent or very good, and that it was a welcoming environment. But most of all, just the last question about how they felt like their ideas and their experience was being heard and considered. And they had confidence that this was time well spent and that their ideas are going to be used by this advocacy organization that represents them. And, that's, I think, one of the most important outcomes to the human-centered design process. Next slide, please. Okay, so now for a very different example, I just wanted to give kind of contrasting examples of how you could use human-centered design. Next slide, please. This is a different project, actually from a couple of years ago. And my team was asked to come in and think about, we were asked by a school district to come in and help improve professional development, the PD system in this school district. And this district had a very robust system. They had coaches, they had professional learning communities, they were training their teachers on the pyramid model for social emotional learning. But when we came in and we would do our walkthroughs in the classroom and observations, we could see that the teachers were saying all the right things, but they weren't quite doing it. And so, we spent a lot of time talking to the coaches and the administrators about, different models and different plans for closing this implementation gap. But really, we had this idea that what we needed to do was ask the teachers what's going on and what they needed, right? So that's exactly what we did. And next slide, please. What they told us was that they wanted three things. They wanted to be able to get reminders from their training in bite-sized pieces. They wanted to be able to choose what they focus on in their classroom according to what was going on in their classroom and what they were seeing in the kids. And they wanted time to be able to use the strategies that they were learning and then reflect on it so that they could understand the effect that their new practices were having on the kids in their classroom. So we went through this process for a year of, it was laborious, but, setting up spreadsheets for each teacher and sending out the spreadsheets and giving them the opportunity to pick these strategies and then use them and then reflect on them. And they would send us back their scores. And basically what we found at the end of the year, we called it an external evaluator, and the teachers who were going through this process that they all opted into were scoring higher on their teacher observation scores than teachers who were also getting the coaching and the professional learning communities, but not going through this practice. Next slide, please. So we actually thought it was a great idea and turned it into an app, which we now offer to the field. But the important thing about this tool for our discussion that we're having here now is that this is not a tool that was created by a tech company. It wasn't what we thought that we would do when we partnered with the school district, right? This is an idea that came from the teachers because we listened to them and we listened. All we did was listen to what they wanted and then just gave it to them. Next slide, please. So I'm going to wrap up here as we are running out of time, but I wanted to leave you with some ideas about, when you go about using human-centered design, and there are many resources online that you can go to learn about using human-centered design. But there are some key considerations that I have found over the years are very important for successfully using human-centered design. The first is time. This is kind of the biggest thing. When using human-centered design, you really do need to slow down and make the time to connect with many people. Because this, as I said, is the squiggly line. It is not a fast and efficient process. The fastest way to do something is to do it yourself. This is not what human-centered design is about. So make the time to do this and plan for it. The mindsets, as you remember, this is about curiosity and humility and being able to set aside the idea that you are the expert and listen to the expertise of other people as well. This is about centering relationships. As I said, we say people over process, process over product, right? If you take that time again to foster those relationships, you're going to go further together with different people. Uncertainty is a big part of the human-centered design process. You have to be able to sit in discomfort because when we we let go of the idea that we know where we should go, it can be really disorienting to not know where you need to go, but have faith in the process and the people you're working with, and you will get to a better place. And then finally, as I just said, this is really about letting go. It's about giving up power and giving up control. Where you end up may not be where you thought you were going to go, but hopefully it's a better place. And with that, I leave you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me here.
Thank you so much. I think it just stood out to me. You can hear things, you can read them and prepare for them, and then you hear the phrase being willing to be uncomfortable with uncertainty, or it not ending up where you think it's going to go. And I just such a beautiful thought to consider as we are now going to go into some time to have some breakout groups where everyone will